It's a great honor to be back at the Beinecke, so to speak. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm very honored to have been invited to give this presentation today that is based, as Michael said, on work that I did at the Beinecke. This book would not have been possible without the Beinecke Library at Yale University. I was there thanks to an Edith and Richard French Fellowship in the fall of 2014 and spent many, many hours in the reading room there and in a really concentrated research trip. And it was so productive and it was so wonderful. And I have very fond memories of my time working there. All of my work is really very archivally based. And any of you who've done that kind of work know that some archives are better than others and more friendly than others. And I have nothing but wonderful memories and thoughts to say about the folks at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. So thank you very much for everything there and for inviting me back. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see. And Michael, if there's any problems, please let me know if there's any technical glitches on your end. And this is the book Paper Bullets, and I'm going to talk about really just for about 15 or 20 minutes or so, not a long time. This is a much shorter version of a talk that I have given, and if you're interested in the longer version, you can go to my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, and you can watch videos of me giving a much longer presentation. I've given this at numerous venues in the United States and Europe. And of course, if you're interested, the book, you can find out more by reading the book and seeing what the product of this research at the Beinecke was all about. I want to begin then by introducing you, if I can get my slide to advance here, introducing you to two remarkable women that I write about in the book. And if you know something about art and especially about the history of photography, then you may have heard of them. But even if you do know their work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Now, their story has really inspired me and many other people that I've told it to, and so I'm very glad to be able to share it with you today. So meet Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that many of you have probably never heard of. They were both Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer, and Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. Together, the two of them collaborated on what people in their own day saw as sometimes shocking photographs. Now, they were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day: Picasso, André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau, and many others. But their images turned ideas of gender and identity on their heads. And more than anything, that's what they're known for today. And if you do know them, you know them by some different names. And I'll talk more about that, their names, in just a moment. But after they left Paris and left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, which is one of the British Channel Islands. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of soldiers. And in brief, here's how it worked. Lucy and Suzanne created a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in some very unexpected ways, with notes and messages, summaries of BBC News reports, drawings, songs, bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, all written or typed on little slips of paper that they left for the Germans to find. And in some cases, they even put their notes directly into the pockets of German soldiers themselves. And what you're seeing here on the screen are some copies, some post-war reproductions of some of those notes that are currently held in the Beinecke Library. Now, there were some key things about their life stories, which, although they didn't know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. First of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. And although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish heritage that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair, during which crowds outside the family's apartment shouted, "Down with the Jews." Later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. So Lucy and Suzanne both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society and played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. Their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters as well. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and her guiding principle. She wrote, "I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her." And you can see in this image that's on the right-hand side of your screen, which is actually from the collection in Jersey, you can see the letters at the top of the screen, at the top of the illustration, LSM. Those are their initials intertwined, LS, Lucy Schwab, SM, Suzanne Malherbe. But when you read those three letters in French phonetically, it creates the sentence Elles s'aiment, which means they love each other. Now, drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explored gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. And this is one of the things that they're most famous for today. As I said, in fact, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather they're known by their gender-neutral artistic names that they took. Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Really, it should be in French pronounced Claude Cahun, but most English speakers that I've encountered tend to pronounce it Claude Cahun, so I'll probably say Cahun myself today. Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Now, they assumed these names to create new identities and also to cross gender lines. Claude in particular is a name that's used by both men and women in French. Cahun put it this way in a memoir that she published in 1930. Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation. So gender was for Cahun situational, conditional, fluid, depending on the moment. Yet throughout their lives, they always still called one another Lucy and Suzanne. Those are the names on their tombstone. As scholars today call them Cahun and Moore because we know them almost entirely through their art, but the historical record is very clear that they did not use these artistic names exclusively. Now, Lucy's new artistic name, Claude Cahun, also allowed her to express her Jewishness. And indeed, the name change for her was as much about Jewishness as it was about gender, because Cahun is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew for priest. Yet gender was also absolutely essential. It was absolutely central to their work, which in some ways helped to invent the notion of what we would now call queerness long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories decades before scholars would really even take up those questions. Now, Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in the avant-garde art world of Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, in 1937, when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were very familiar to them. It was also a perfect respite for Lucy's chronic ill health, through which Suzanne had helped to nurse her over the years. And Paris had become deeply politically polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. So when they left Paris and the art world behind, they generally stopped using the names Cahun and Moore and returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. So I refer to them in the book primarily as Lucy and Suzanne because I'm dealing mainly with their post-Paris lives. Little did they know, though, that when they moved to Jersey, they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action, but by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front lines. The islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, a line of defense in the West that was designed to keep the Allies at bay. Thousands of German troops soon arrived to build fortifications, which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands, and no dissent could be tolerated in such a strategically important location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day, and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so too. They put their creative talents and their political inclinations and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and some very stressful moments. I really don't believe that either woman alone could have done this work. Just like their art, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential. But the notes they wrote were powerful indeed, and some copies of those notes, like the one you see on your screen, are found in the Beinecke Library's collection. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops, or to convince them to desert, or to mutiny, or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in occupied territories, tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving these notes all around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on fence posts, sometimes on cafe tables, sometimes tucked into magazines and newsstands, sometimes placed inside German staff cars parked along the street, and sometimes even in their own pockets. The notes served to stoke the Germans' paranoia about conspiracies on the island. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but not with their own names, but with the name of an author that they invented. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But the persona was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines once again, this time in effect becoming, so to speak, a German soldier. So when they wrote in this male German voice aimed at other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. So I think what Lucy and Suzanne were doing here was rewriting the inner script, or what the Yale political theorist James C. Scott calls the hidden transcripts, that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would, you might say, go viral among the troops. If a German read their notes signed by the soldier with no name and believed that they really were written by a comrade, then Lucy and Suzanne hoped he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, I learned so much of this story, especially the parts about their arrest and their interrogation and their trial and their time in prison, through the documents contained in the Beinecke's collection. Really, as I said, the book could not have been written without the time that I spent there in the library. And that's especially where I was able to recover Suzanne's voice. And you see her on the right-hand side of your screen. I was able to recover her voice and to understand exactly how central she was to this effort. Many of the scholars who know their work and know them through their work, as Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, really only talk about Cahun and give her the credit both for their art and for their anti-Nazi resistance. But I believe that that's a fundamental misunderstanding of their lifelong collaboration as artists and resistors. All of the photography that they're famous for and all of their resistance activities was really a true collaboration. Now, I can say more about this in the discussion period if anyone's interested, but for now, I'll just say that the documents in the Beinecke collection really helped me to prove just how much of a creative partnership that their work was, because it allowed me to restore Suzanne's voice to the narrative of their life stories. Now, those documents in the Beinecke also presented me with some great challenges. As you can see through these two images of Suzanne's post-war writings. And these are some photos that I took of the materials in the Beinecke collection. And you can see that what Suzanne did was to write, she would write some sentences, and then you can see she would draw a line, and then she would write another sentence or phrase and then draw a line, another sentence, and then she would draw a line. And you can see, especially on the right-hand side, she would just fill up the entire page. But each of those sections are not necessarily related to one another. Those lines denote separate thoughts. They're separate issues. You can also see that both of these are recycled or reused scraps of paper. The one on the right is an envelope. The one on the left is, I think it's the frontispiece to a book maybe. And on the one on the left, she would write and then rotate the page to try to essentially, I guess, save paper or to maximize the space that she had. So this was sort of the state that a lot of the documents were in. And I had to do a lot of digital cutting and pasting to try to piece together the story that she tells that really is scattered and broken up in these bits throughout the collection. So you can't just sit down and read any of these documents straight through and get a narrative. I mean, I literally did have to digitally cut and repaste and to try to piece this together in a way that, you know, any research project is like putting a puzzle together. But this one I think was much more so even than any other project that I've tried to do. And part of it is because of the state of the documents that you see here. And that's because of how Suzanne wrote on these often scraps of paper. In addition, what I found, as I said, was very crucial to corroborating the story that Lucy herself had really admitted in some of her writing. But part of that story is something that many scholars overlook, and that really is Suzanne's crucial role to this, to what they did. And I think the best place to see that is in one of the stories of their interrogation that I tell in the book. And I'm going to close on this story. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police on Jersey, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out the phrase, "I am on my father's side of Jewish origin." So what she was doing was essentially admitting to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. And then she confessed to this supposed crime by telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing, all of the resistance, was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, if you read the documents closely, she was not really claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind their campaign. In fact, Lucy herself knew just how much of the resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy herself wrote, "It was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid." Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness and in seeming to take the credit was really an attempt to take the fall and to try to save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had the motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Well, I want to end on that note to respect our time and to open up floor for conversation and questions.